have a little bit more of an expanded understanding on what trauma is. Now, the goal is to bring these things to the light. There's a lot of that sense of helplessness and powerlessness that can also trigger that trauma. There's none of that right now. We can't really make any plans. We don't know. There's this big question mark to do the individual work to release that from our hearts and our nervous systems. We quite experienced in our lives, but we're feeling it through these generations. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Whole Wellness Method video. I am Lida Sportel at the upcoming lidashealing.com and founder of the Whole Wellness Method, and I want to continue to support you in the Getting Through the Coronavirus Crisis with You video series. And so today I want to talk about something a little bit different that we haven't quite explored yet. We've been exploring a lot about like the physical realm, what to do with our bodies and how to protect our bodies and all these different scientific things. But what about our emotions? What about our thoughts? What about our psychology? What about what this whole thing is doing to us, this whole pandemic, how it's impacting all of us on such a deep level, psychologically speaking. And I don't think that there is anyone that would disagree that this is really deeply impacting us on a psychological level. And if somebody is disagreeing, it's probably because they're not allowing to see this deeper level of the impact that this whole thing is having on us. But specifically what I want to talk about today, and I will have a lot of different videos discussing the psychological impact and the different emotions that we are experiencing through this. And but today I really wanted to talk about something that was brought to my attention recently in terms of how this is really triggering a collective trauma, meaning that we're all collectively, because we're all around the globe, are experiencing the effects of this pandemic. So there's not many times in our lives that we can say that we're all experiencing the same thing. So and for that reason, it's on the psychological level, this is kind of triggering a collective trauma. And so the way I understand this, and in terms of how it was presented to me, is that we've been all throughout our lives just walking around doing what we do every day, but kind of walking with this unconscious burden, this unconscious baggage of trauma. And by trauma, let me clarify, I don't just mean necessarily traumatic experiences as we define them in like the DSM, or as a psychotherapist, we have certain criteria that we have to meet in order to call something traumatic. But I want to expand that definition to anything that is kind of unsettling to our nervous system. Anything that is traumatic would be anything that we cannot quite process very well. Anything that we are going to use our defense mechanisms and try to suppress it and deny it and push it aside because we just can't deal with it. Or anything that we suppress but then is controlling us. So I know I'm using some, psychological jargon here, but I want to keep it really simple and just say traumatic experiences or trauma could be anything that for you personally you feel has been unresolved, and that has been you've been unable to quite process and heal and release from your body, from your psychological realm as well. So given that now we have a little bit more of an expanded understanding on what trauma is, let me go back to this concept of this collective trauma. So this pandemic, because it is impacting every single one of us, it is triggering for every one of us something, whether we're aware of it or not. And so there's this collective trauma that we're all experiencing. But then what matters really is on an individual level, on that collective trauma, how is it that you are experiencing that? What is it that it's bringing up for you? So we got, people on the one side of the spectrum where they don't seem to be caring about this. They have no fear about this, no anxiety. They, don't even think to they don't even seem to think that this is concerning. And then we got the other end of the spectrum where there's this utter panic attacks, and they're unable to process what's happening, and the fear that this is inducing is off the charts. And so we got anything in that spectrum, anywhere in between. So you could be anywhere in that realm, and there's no right or wrong. It's not like we should be one way or another. But what I think it is important to do is to acknowledge what that whole situation is bringing up for you. And you might see that from that collective trauma, the way that you are experiencing that individual trauma, or that sense of unresolved emotions or unresolved experiences that might be coming up right now, I think it is important for each and every one of us to do that inner work, to do that introspection, and to look within and to see what are those deeper layers that are being uncovered right now through what I'm experiencing. And so by talking to some of my clients and just collecting a list of different experiences that people are having right now, I'll give you some of the examples, and you might relate to some of these. You might not. You might have something else that I'll be very happy to hear as well. So some of the traumas, if you will, that are being triggered for people right now, and in me saying all these different ones right now, the goal is to bring these things to the light, because everything that we suppress is controlling us. Everything that we resist and we don't want to see it, we don't want to deal with it, persists. Everything that we want to keep in the dark and we don't want to acknowledge is actually making us feel worse. So my hopes in discussing this is to really bring these things to the surface so that we can heal them. So some of the examples of the traumas that are being triggered right now are the trauma of sickness, right? The trauma of getting sick. And that's a huge one, because there are people who have been sick, have been battling with chronic illness, and these are a lot of my clients that have been chronically ill, whatever chronic illness that might be. And now there's this sense of even more that fear, that trauma of being sick again, and obviously the trauma of death, the fear of death, the trauma of what if my body can't handle this sickness from this virus. So there's a lot of deep fear and trauma of sickness, of death, that can be triggered with this. Also the trauma of sickness or death for a loved one, because maybe you're not so worried about yourself, maybe you're worried about a loved one that is vulnerable. That is a huge sense of fear and trauma, and that could be something again that you've felt in the past in other circumstances, and now it's really brought up to the surface a lot more, because now we're really feeling that we don't have any control over this, and that we don't actually know how to treat this quite yet. So a lot of fear around that and a lot of old trauma that could be triggered. Another one is a trauma of isolation, that sense of really being restricted from your normal life, from the routine you've had, from being social with other people, from going out to a restaurant and hanging out with your friends and having people over, whatever you were doing in your daily life, and having to feel like you are restricted from being in contact with other people. There's a huge trauma there that for some people that triggers old things as well. And again, this is a deeper exploration that you might want to do as I'm bringing these things up. Also, there's the trauma of helplessness, feeling like who is going to help me if I need to support in whatever way, or how am I going to help somebody I love if I feel that there's no way I can help them. So there's a lot of that sense of helplessness and powerlessness that can also trigger that trauma. The trauma of feeling that we are at the mercy of forces beyond our control. That's a big one for a lot of people, because we usually feel that we got our lives under control for the most part. We know what to expect, we know what our routines are, what our jobs are, what we have to do. We go to the grocery store, we expect to find certain things there, we expect to, kids go to school and so on and so forth, and things run a certain way. Now everything has been disrupted. We don't know for how long. And we are at the mercy of, it feels like, this virus and of forces beyond our control that we have no idea when they will end, when they will get better, how they will get better. So there's this whole, again, powerlessness and that sense of like we're inferior. We are at the mercy of something way stronger than us. So there's a lot of trauma there too that could be triggered for some people in what I'm describing. Another one is the trauma of not knowing, the trauma of uncertainty, the trauma of the unknown. That's a big one, because we usually can plan. We can say, in a week, I'm going to have this party, or I'm going to go to this event, or in a month, I'm planning to take that trip, or in 2 months, my kids get off school and we're going to do this. There's none of that right now. We can't really make any plans. We don't know. There's this big question mark as to what tomorrow looks like, let alone a month or two later. So it's a scary place to be at, and it can trigger trauma for a lot of people, that sense of uncertainty. Again, if any of that is bringing up emotions for you, the goal is to acknowledge them and to, I will use some techniques in different videos to help process through all that. And I am coming up with a new course program on getting through the coronavirus crisis with you, where I will be offering a lot more of these tools and specific techniques to help process all these different feelings. But for the purposes of this video, I just want to bring some of these things to light and see how much you can work through this, and how much it is something that you want to slowly acknowledge and process. But again, the goal is to bring these things to light so that we can release them and heal them. Because the way we work on this collective trauma to heal that is by, on an individual level, to do the individual work to release that from our hearts and our nervous systems. So another trauma is the trauma of loss. For a lot of us, we've had to give up and sacrifice a lot of things that meant a lot to us. We've had to lose things because of this. And then, of course, there's the loss of lives. There's the loss of money. There's the loss of so many different levels of loss. So that's another big one. And it's also this sense of not knowing or not being able to control what I need, what I'm going to have to lose. Because before, we had a certain amount of ability to predict what we could have and what we might lose. Now, we seem to be at the mercy again of all these forces beyond our control that can take things away from us at any moment. And so that's a big sense of trauma again. The trauma of not having enough. The trauma of not having enough any of the things that we were so used to having that we never even thought about, that we wouldn't have toilet paper, or that we wouldn't have Kleenex tissues, or that we wouldn't be able to find the favorite, produce or steak that we wanted, or whatever it is that we think that we took for granted. And that now we're seeing that none of that is to be taken for granted, and that there isn't enough. So that's triggering a lot of those primitive parts of our brains, and it's pushing us into a survival mode that for some people has become, and we tend to judge those people that have been, operating from that survival standpoint. But this is not about judging. This is about seeing what that trauma is that each and every one of us is experiencing through this. And it could be very different for each and every one of us. But this whole thing of not having enough, see what that is bringing up for you. The other huge one right now is the trauma of not having enough money, of finances in general. And that's a huge one, and I will do some videos on that alone, because right now, with the way this whole situation is evolving, that is impacting us financially on many different levels. And so there's a lot of trauma around that. And if you've had already trauma with money before, now it's been amplified tenfold. Another one that's come up with my clients is the trauma of like the authority figures, these authorities that are telling us what to do, that are deciding for our lives, that are deciding what we should do next or what we shouldn't do. There's a lot of trauma there, especially if you've had authority figures in your life that have mistreated you before, or have made decisions on your behalf before, and that they were not the best decisions. Trauma of abandonment. That's another one that's been triggered right now. So see what that, if you resonate with that, abandonment on so many different levels, feeling abandoned by society, by your body, by, the ability to be able to rely on things that you used to be able to rely on. Another big one is trauma of feeling blindsighted, like how suddenly this whole thing came about. But it did kind of happen suddenly, meaning that we weren't quite expecting 2020 to be this way. We all had our plans about 2020, and then we completely had to really cancel everything and stop working for a lot of us, and different things like that. So there's that sense of being blindsided, that sense of being kind of like somebody is, interfering with our lives, and that it's happening in a way where we really feel we can't trust. So see again what that brings up for you. And then to finish up, it's the trauma of deprivation and scarcity, which I kind of mentioned before as well, with not having enough, but also the trauma of our ancestors. So I really wanted to finish with that one, because a lot of the times it could be that in this, life, you didn't quite have a specific trauma, but all this is bringing up for you emotions that you maybe didn't have necessarily before, but one of your ancestors had, parents, grandparents. And so it is interesting to see that for some of us, this is actually bringing up an inherited trauma. It's bringing up an intergenerational trauma, which means that, our grandparents went through some horrific, traumatic events and situations and emotions, and now we are kind of feeling something similar that they felt. It's not quite ours. It's not something that we quite experienced in our lives, but we're feeling it through these generations. And so that's another interesting trauma to not overlook. I think we need to include that into our conversation, especially for us who are very empathic and who feel deeply and who are being triggered by this. And by intergenerational and inherited trauma, it could also mean that you're feeling like you're able to manage this situation in a certain way, and that you're able to kind of handle what's going on. But then you have a parent or another figure in your life that is really being triggered by this for their own reasons, and now you're feeling like you're picking up on their emotions and their energy, or even the society's energy and their society's emotions, that you're feeling that, whereas on your own you're really trying to make the most of it and move forward, but you're picking up on other people's emotions and traumas. So that's again back to that collective trauma, that on an individual level maybe you don't relate to anything I said, but you are relating to feeling it from what everybody else is feeling. So that's what I wanted to discuss in this video, and I hope that it brought up some light for you, that it raised the awareness a little bit on this topic, and it is something that we continue to discuss a lot further inside the program, because it has a lot of layers to it and a lot of depth to it. And I do use some specific techniques to help clear all this out and heal from that, because I do feel that this is a very, very important thing to do. And so I hope this was helpful, and I will see you next time, leaving you in whole wellness. Bye-bye.